You are listening to Neurosalience, the OHBM podcast.
Welcome to the Organization for Human Brain Mapping Neurosalience podcast. I'm your host, Peter Bannattini. Here I interview neuroscientists and discuss their work, as well as the latest developments, issues, and controversies in the field of brain mapping. Today I'm talking with David Poeppel. David Poeppel is professor of psychology and neuroscience at New York University. Since 2014, he has also been the director of the Department of Neuroscience at Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics. In 2019, he co-founded the Center for Language, Music, and Emotion, an international joint research center co-sponsored by the Max Planck Society and New York University. Since 2021, he has now also become the managing director of the Ernst Strungmann Institute in Germany. And we talk a little bit about that at the beginning of the podcast. David grew up in Munich, Germany, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Caracas, Venezuela. He obtained his bachelor's degree in 1990 and doctorate in 1995 from MIT. He received training in functional brain imaging as a postdoctoral fellow at the School of Medicine in the University of California, San Francisco. From 2000 to 2008, he directed the Cognitive Neuroscience of Language Laboratory at the University of Maryland, College Park, where he was professor of linguistics and biology. He joined New York University in 2009. He was a fellow at the Berlin Institute for Advanced Study and has been a guest professor at several institutions. He's received the Daimler-Chrysler Berlin Prize of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as many other honors. David's a researcher who employs behavioral and cognitive neuroscience approaches to study the brain basis of auditory processing, speech perception, and language comprehension. The research in his laboratory addresses questions such as, what's the cognitive and neuronal parts list that form the basis for language processing? The fundamental constituents used in speech and language. How is sensory information transformed into the abstract representations that underlie language processing? What are the neural circuits that enable language processing? So he uses an array of tools, including fMRI, but everything from single unit recordings all the way on up, and he's planning on actually getting into more animal research. And he also thinks very deeply about cognitive neuroscience and the appropriate models for what's actually happening, which we're far from fully understanding. So well-known contributions from his laboratory include the functional anatomic model of language, which he developed with Greg Hickok, research on lateralization of auditory processing, which he also developed with Greg Hickok, and experimental work on the role of neural oscillations in audition and speech perception. He also writes and lectures about methodological questions at the interdisciplinary boundary between cognitive science research and brain research. So he has, I would recommend several of his opinion papers, which are extremely interesting and informative. So with that, I'd like to go into the podcast. Thank you. David, welcome.
Hey, Peter, are we on here?
We are on.
Are we off? Because I need to say stuff. I've got stuff to say. So
well, this is the place.
We got to get right into it.
All right. This is the place, and this is where stuff will be said and thoughts will be had. So thanks for coming.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm really looking forward to chatting.
Yeah. Well, great. We'll get right into it. So, in my introduction to you, I mentioned Max Planck, but it turns out that you now have a different job. So now you're both at NYU as a professor at NYU, and also you just switched. So, do you want to get into describing?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I can tell you a little bit. So I've been working between kind of going back and forth between New York and Frankfurt, Germany, for a few years, and working for an institute of the Max Planck Society, which is a big publicly funded institution. They have 84 or 86 institutes across many fields, really wonderful research opportunities. Last summer, I was approached by the Max Planck Society to think about a different position affiliated with them, slightly differently structured, to help run a systems neuroscience institute. And also in Frankfurt, it's called the Ernst Strungmann Institute, or ESI, AZ, we call it, which is a institute that's it's about 10 years old. It's been focused almost entirely on non-human primate research, with very senior PIs. Wolf Singer is the most senior person there, Pascal Fries, and a number of other really fantastic group leaders have been there. And they're in the goal to reorganize a little bit and also to expand the scope to include more human neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience. I agreed to take over this institute. So now I'm still going back and forth between New York and Germany, but now to this more really neuroscience-y focused center, which is also a good fit to my own interests and ambitions and what I think are cool opportunities for the future of research.
Okay, cool. And you had mentioned to me before the podcast that you're getting a human 7T as well, and other types of things. We're doing both primate and
yeah, so the infrastructure, there's of course a really first-rate infrastructure to do physiology work there, and it's been the bread and butter of these institutions. But partly the aim is now to grow pretty aggressively in the human neuroscience and actually in more collaborative situation with clinical work. And so there will be a 7T, multiple 3Ts, multiple MEG systems, actually of different forms, squid-based and optically pumped magnetometers.
Wow.
So there's a lot of appetite for human neuroscience, and there's a lot of appetite for more systematic linking to clinical work. And of course, as is now kind of customary, for better or for worse, I think perhaps for better, is a lot of computational neuroscience, right? So theory. So it's a trope, but I keep saying it. We're getting better and better at big data, but we have not gotten better at big theory. So hopefully we can help recruit, sharp young people to tell us what we're doing wrong, what we can be doing better, where the opportunities are, and so on.
Okay, cool. And so I always wondered, though, still, regardless of the fact that you have two jobs across the Atlantic, how do you generally? I always wondered how you manage your time. How do you,
Very poorly. I manage my time very poorly. And initially, I had this kind of, you do it for idealistic reasons, and partly for opportunistic reasons, and partly for vanity, and probably all of them are bad reasons. But I started out with this notion of, this is very simple, because you just say, well, I'm going to be 6 weeks here, 6 weeks there. It's not that difficult. Flights are easy and frequent, and there's whatever. COVID notwithstanding, there's probably 10 or 20 flights a day between these two cities. So it's not problematic from an administrative point of view. Yeah. But of course, it quickly turns out that you're always needed somewhere for some random things where you just have to be, that are not Zoom based. And yeah. So in the end, I have been going back and forth the last years, a little bit more kind of a la carte, right? So sometimes I show up in one place and I'm there for a week and then I return. Huh. Other times I've been there for a couple of months and return. So it's been more need-based, but it's possible. And I think now that we've gotten, for better or for worse, we've gotten good at using a kind of Zoom-based lifestyle. I've learned more about what can and can't be done at a distance.
Yeah.
And that's actually good. I think that's helpful, and it's not really necessary to go to every damn event because why bother?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's not a good idea. So you have to have a good, be able to sleep in various places and have a circadian clock that switches rapidly. But there's also something very joyful, I think, about getting the different perspectives from US-based science and European-based science. Yeah. Regularly, right? It's kind of cool to get off the plane and read, what are the newspapers saying here, or what's the vibe? What are students and postdocs worried about? And often it's very similar, but it's not identical. Yeah. It has to do with how science is organized, how funding is organized, how institutions are organized, and I've come to appreciate the the different places a lot, actually, because they're just quite different in what's offered. I mean, there's something about the frenetic pace. So I'm sitting in my NYU lab right now, which is really small.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really small, right? It's just like, I don't know, there's like a couple of rooms where everyone's kind of sitting in the same, it's like the NIH, right? So if you just squish into one office and there's like a bunch of desks next to each other, but there's something also very stimulating about the intensity of that, and it's slightly insane, and we actually work too much in principle. And so when I come there and when I go to Europe, I'm like, well, they're taking, it's pretty chill. You know, weekends are a serious thing.
Yeah.
End of the day is a serious thing. Holiday is a serious thing. And so I'm learning to appreciate the two, the kind of different ways of living, and what works and what doesn't work. And it's a chance to kind of go back and forth.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. That's actually, I mean, definitely you have unique, I don't know anyone else who does, you know, with that time constant, you know, going back and forth like that, getting this constant, yeah, I'm sure it's stimulating. And if you can handle it.
I mean, sometimes it's insane, right? Sometimes you're like, well, this is just a mistake, because you're adding complexity also, you know, personally can be difficult.
Yeah.
But you have to have an, I mean, so I have to say one thing that makes it, you know, for people entertaining this kind of crazy thing, it's helpful to have some kind of principled embedding in the different places. So I would not have done this if I didn't have a kind of personal connection to Germany, right?
Yeah.
So I spent my high school years there. My father and my sisters live there. I speak the language. So I have a bunch of reasons that it's not crazy, right? So I have a sort of biographical connection to the place. I would imagine it would be quite different if you're sort of disconnected, if you don't have some kind of grounding. I think that would add a lot of stress.
Yeah.
So I think the fact that it's sort of personally uncomplicated takes a little bit of the edge off. And I don't think I would have taken a job like this or tried to sort of bridge two different kind of jobs and cultures if they were really misaligned or more distant. I think that would be too challenging, actually, because you'd spend so much life on just managing your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, no, you're right. I mean, that's, yeah, it's hard enough for, right, just most people in one institute sort of going, but definitely what's interesting to me also is that, right, at NYU, not only do you see the energy and the different culture, but I mean, is the agenda different? I mean, is it more like maybe cognitive neuroscience?
Yeah, I mean, so I've tried to align the things as best as possible. In fact, I founded, together with some colleagues, a kind of joint research center, which we called CLAIM, the Center for Language and Music and Emotion, to work on areas of investigation that are that are sort of, you know, to use the cheesy grant word, synergistic, or for interdisciplinary cross-fertilization. And that's because those are areas of research that are particularly strong in both places and have interesting ways to add to each other. And that's been going okay. But yeah, the agendas are a little bit different, especially now as I'm switching more to systems neuroscience. Certainly the work at NYU is firmly grounded in kind of cognitive neuroscience theory, and much more close to, let's say, linguistic research.
Right.
And the work now in Germany is really just embedded in a systems neuroscience thing, right?
Yeah.
So where your average colleague that you run into is working on a single unit recording or on a neuropixel recording in a mouse or in a marmoset.
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit different because the data are different, the lab stuff is different, and there's, it's always good to remember that those of us who work on human stuff, it's pretty nice that we can just simply call up a person and say, hey, we're going to pay you $10 or $20, come in for a couple of hours and we're going to stick you in a machine.
Yeah.
And we don't spend 6 months training them to make an eye movement to the right if they see red. So it's good to remember that when you're doing the often very satisfying neuroscience that can come with animal models, there's a long time horizon, right? So if you're working with a rhesus macaque on, I don't know, reaching or decision making using eye movement control or something, it's months and months of training to get to the state where the experiment can then be executed. So we have that. So we do have certain luxuries that we can explain to any participant who walks into our lab. Look, when you see that, press that button.
Yeah.
Right. That's kind of cool.
Well, yeah, that is. But of course, right. There's always a risk of.
And the price we pay is, I mean, so we can do a lot. And the price we pay is, of course, resolution, or let's say granularity of biological question.
Yep.
And that's enough.
Which actually I'll get into a little bit later about why the field probably needs more of this cross subdisciplinary interaction in that regard, to sort of maybe we can learn something from either side in terms of how to form our questions the best. When I was looking into sort of what's been going on in your life, it seems that it struck me that there's been this cognitive neuroscience series that's been, I think Gazadaga has been in charge of that for a long time. Now it looks like you're the senior editor. So that's a tome that comes out like every 5 years. Every 5 years. Yeah. And so what is that all about for people who don't know?
Yeah, probably everyone's heard of Mike Gazadaga, who's sort of formative, founding cognitive neuroscience. And he's been really important in getting us sort of as a field organized in terms of having summer schools, founding a journal, the society, the annual meeting. So he's been very kind of, he and friends and colleagues have been very strong advocates of this for 30 years or so. I think the first meetings were probably like in the early 90s or 90 or so.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Mike organized over the years is every 5 years, a kind of more sustained meeting where actually the people who participate, other than the faculty, are fellows, which are typically postdocs, who've been at a previous meeting. But they're sort of pre-selected to be particularly engaged in the field. And out of this comes a very fat book called The Cognitive Neurosciences, very in-bait. And it's been it's a fascinating book to look at always, because it's sort of an inventory of where we are, right? And it's in my role. So I took it over now as the senior editor, which is, I'm really excited about. It was a wonderful opportunity, and to begin to have it reflect a slightly different emphasis. Right? So things have changed in the last years.
Yeah,
I tried to expand the scope a little bit in terms of the topics, and add some things that had, and it'll change. You can't, you don't want to do everything with one fell swoop. You want to be a little incremental. There's been this wonderful historical work. I tried to add a bunch more stuff on computation, and I also tried to expand the editorial representation to be a little bit more inclusive.
Okay.
Broad-based in the all the necessary senses of inclusivity.
Yeah.
And so each section has, more than one editor, for example, and I tried to find a kind of richer balance. And it's actually really fun to work on. It's a lot of work because this thing is a monster.
Yeah.
But it's really fun. For any person at any stage of their career, simply to leaf through some section and see what's going on. Look at some of the figures. Yeah. And what are people doing in, decoding fMRI, or taking a look at what's going on in memory research, in action. And it's kind of exciting to see, and it does change actually.
Yeah.
And you can track what stays the same, what changes, and some of it is of course methodology driven, obviously. And some of it is, every now and then there's actually a new idea. Who knew? And some of it is also a celebration of, or let's say not a celebration, I should say. Some of the work shows us digging our heels in and being conservative.
Interesting.
And so, and saying, well, this has kind of worked so far, so let's just kind of go with it, right? So we're interested in the sense of Tom Kuhn, right? So it's kind of normal science.
Yeah.
But it's a really exciting opportunity to do, and the discussions are fantastic. And you just kind of see where things are. Where are we in our field right now?
Is there a meta? So I can imagine. It would be very cool to actually have something similar to that to fMRI or whatever. But and actually, this sort of relates to a discussion I was going to get into later as well, like, the field of neuroscience, or the field of cognitive neuroscience. It's nice that you have this book that summarizes these 5 years. Are there any, is there any sort of like, meta paper on that sort of describes, here are the models, here's where there's gaps, here's where there's not understanding.
There's not, I think, explicit barriers. One hopes, of course, that the editorial summaries of each section provide a little bit of context and say, like, hey, look, this is where things are going.
Yeah.
When you attend the meeting itself, right? So the way this works is you attend the meeting, the faculty give a talk, and then soon thereafter, the people have to submit their chapters.
Okay.
So it's very, so it's very kind of it happens extremely rapidly.
Yeah.
And you do see certain trends and interesting things appear. So, unsurprisingly, in the last years, one of the topics that has come up and has been debated a lot is kind of the notion of big data versus, let's say, deep data.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So that has been, because it cuts across all the fields, like whether you're a memory researcher, vision researcher, language researcher, right? There's been a lot of this, can we get, giant corpora using NLP methods? Can we record, hundreds of people? I mean, so this has been, there's been a bit of a emphasis on engineering, and that's both good and bad. It reflects that we're more sophisticated in our technical approaches. It doesn't follow that we're more sophisticated in our conceptual approaches. And I was sort of struck by the fact that, of course, you listen to some of these talks and you're like, holy shit, it's unbelievable what you can do. It's amazing, right? Yeah. But then you're like, well, but what was actually learned? What was the question that was actually answered? Yep. So, I mean, so on the one hand, because we all like to play with these big toys. You look at the stuff and you're like, oh my God, so cool. And then, later you're like, wait a minute, something's not right here. Yeah. So that was a lot of the vibe I got the last time. It was like, I was simultaneously just struck by how cool the technology is getting every year. But the ideas aren't getting that much smarter. Our ideas are still the same. They're basically 19th century. Yeah, yeah, and
right. There's less using. People are more like still, wading in the data and trying to sort of getting new data and seeing, oh, there's more than we imagined, but without stepping back yet, I guess, as a field.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we are embracing the fact that we can it's just exciting that you can acquire so much data for any given domain. But the question is, are we in danger of substituting that for, let's say, analytic thinking, not just analysis of data? Yeah, yeah. And actually, that's so we'll delve into that, because that's actually the sort of been a recurring theme in many ways. When I talk to other people like who are doing sophisticated modeling or network modeling or whatever, it goes to the question of understanding in that regard. But just before we get to that, I just wanted to jump a little bit into sort of earlier in your career. I think I've known you for at least over 20 years. Oh yeah, a long time.
And I remember seeing. I think when you were at the University of Maryland, I think I met you at a Cognitive Neuroscience meeting. But and it seems like you even then you were very strident, and you had your opinions, and it was great.
I'm not shy, let's say.
Yeah. and I know Greg Hickok as well, and you sort of became at least one of the main contributions that you had so far was this advancing essentially the dual stream model of language processing. So could you, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of people in science right now, and I see this in a lot of postdocs and a lot of graduate students, that they just kind of want to do their thing, and they're a lot of times they're happy sort of confirming models and saying, well, this agrees with that, so everything's cool. You and Greg seemed like you realized something wasn't right, and you put something forward. And what was that process like? I mean, what and then how did you then go about supporting it or developing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because it was an interesting set of ideas and struggles. So historically, so Greg and I we overlapped a bit at MIT. I was a PhD student and Greg was a postdoc, and we didn't actually work much together then, just kind of knew each other and appreciated the work. And then we both carved out kind of similar things, and it started with some observations. When you read anything about brain and language, whether you're studying linguistics, psychology, neuroscience, you open the chapter, you get to you look at the chapters on vision, and they have these richly structured, let's say the Fellman and Van Essen diagram of the 30 to 50 areas and the connectivity, and you're like, well, that's because vision is complicated. Yeah. Then you get to the language chapter, and you get a picture of a left hemisphere, and it has two blobs in it. one in the front, which we call Broca's area, and one in the back, which we call Wernicke's area, and then there's an arrow in between. And that has been, the kind of standard model, and it still is for the most part, textbooks still the standard model. Now, why is so? And it's invariably a left hemisphere. Now, you should respect that model. That that really is due to insights from the early 1860s, and ultimately was sort of summarized in 1885. Okay, so if you now go to the hospital because you have a stroke, you will be diagnosed, and your treatment will be planned on the basis of a model from 1885. Yeah. This should give you pause.
Yeah.
Now, on the other hand, it's impressive. The resilience is impressive because that means that the thinking of these folks, very smart people in the 19th century, was sufficiently sensitive to some distinctions that it has real clinical value, which is incredibly impressive.
Yeah.
Right? So, but it's still, then you're like, you're a grad student or something, and you look at this, and after a while, like, you go to your lectures in grad school on vision, on hearing, on touch, and you see all this extremely complex architecture. And then you get to the language chapter, and you're like, are you for real? Come on. I mean, how naive are we supposed to be? And so, because both of us had an interest in really kind of language processing in a more serious, let's say, formal sense, and took courses in linguistics or psycholinguistics, we were not so satisfied with that, but we didn't really have a good way to grapple with the problem. And then a few anomalies showed up in the data over the years. And one of the main ones, and how Greg and I actually started out, was the observation, which is now actually standard. It was like, people are like, yeah, that's known, that's trivial. But I assure you, it was not fun to make. It was the notion of that actually there's a very, very substantial bilateral contribution to speech process.
Yeah.
Yeah. So whatever you looked at, whether it was lesion data, for example, coming from very interesting things like what's called pure word deafness, from the early imaging data, from whether it was PET studies, early fMRI studies, invariably, no matter what kind of control condition you had, and that of course didn't fit the picture because you're supposed to have a very clearly left lateralized system.
Yeah.
So the first paper to some extent that Greg and I wrote together was to try to kind of rehabilitate the complexity of that simple issue. And boy, were we unpopular with that. I mean, that was a paper we wrote together in 2000. And it's a pretty widely cited paper. And I think Greg actually still has the old reviews that we got. But we were, just called vile and stupid and, insulted as complete, like, wow. How could you possibly think such a thing? We've known for 1,000 years that it's different. But I mean, we were young, and we didn't have any horses in that race. We were just trying to sort out what's going on.
So you're just you were citing, okay.
Yeah, and we just looked at the new literature and like, wait, something's not right. It seems like the much easier theory here is that there's a clear bilateral contribution to that particular set of subroutines.
Yeah. And
we have to deal with it. We have to incorporate. So that was the first step, simply to establish the kind of very clear bilateral structure of some of the processes. And that, when we were pretty young, some of the reviews we got in the comments, there were, it's easy to sort of take it and laugh about it now. It wasn't that funny when we were young because you're not used to that kind of review.
Yeah.
Some senior people telling you you're some kind of moron,
Wow.
So it was the most banal thing. And now if you look at it, so open parenthesis, ironic comment. When we were starting out that way, we were considered completely idiotic and I think we got one letter saying you clearly don't know anything about the field and stuff like that. So we're like a little hurt.
Yeah.
Whatever, we chopped away because we were young. We were just kind of like trying to get tenure or whatever we were doing, or we were postdocs, I guess. And then now, so we were just wildly derided. Now, a lot later, when you go to a lot of talks, someone will show that picture of the model that we developed over the years. And that's now considered the old white guy model that's boring and must be wrong. So we never had the good years. First, we were hated for being outrageous, and now we're hated for being like the establishment. So we're like, when is there a good part here? Okay, but the observation, so it was actually driven by empirical observations that were really a mixture of both neuropsychology, so patient deficit lesion correlation, and the earliest imaging studies that were the first ones, of course, were based on PET studies, and then from the early 90s on fMRI studies.
Yeah.
And that was really a revelation. And to this day, for me, it remains really interesting that there is such a disconnection between the data you can get from neuropsychology and from imaging.
Interesting.
And that's still true for a lot of domains, actually, right? There's a lot of cases where there's not a really particularly compelling alignment between deficit lesion correlation in patients and what you get from, let's say, a very, let's say, thoroughly and carefully done fMRI study. And that's gives me a little, both are really important sources of evidence for trying to understand what we're trying to understand, like how the human brains work. But it's an interesting problem in its own right.
Yeah. So I mean, right, with imaging data, obviously it's hard to, with lesions, you get a sense of causality, but with imaging, it's impossible to tricky to get at what's essential.
You have these methodological kind of restrictions, but it's clearly critical to sort of be sensitive to these different kind of data. Certainly, for example, when you're talking about patient work and clinical work, where you, of course, an individual patient is, his or her own most urgent case. Yeah. It's not particularly, statistical regularity is no substitute for personal misery. I mean, you have your data to be clear for that person.
So just to ask a little bit more detailed, so you basically saw, I mean, obviously with neuroimaging data, you see more of a bilateral. There's also a ventral dorsal sort of.
Right. So that's the next step. So then the notion of bilaterality, which is now sort of banal and pretty much like that's a known.
Yeah. That's what really known though. Is it like really known if it's bilateral?
Well, the particular. Yeah, I mean, what the particular computational contributions are of course under debate, but that's true for every region.
Right.
So people have different, very, very, rich and interesting theories. Jeff Binder has a very detailed understanding of what happens in the earlier, bilateral things versus what happens downstream. I have a story. Greg has a story. A lot of people. I mean, but that's whether that would be on one side or both sides. That's simply trying to understand. We don't have a good grip on. Well, what are the primitives? I mean, what is the unit we're looking for? So that's, but more on that maybe later.
Yeah.
So the next step was to then figure out, to try to embed this more in the biology literature in a slightly different way. So once we had established the bilateral, established in the sense that postulated, the conjectured, one thing that both Greg and I were inspired by, and it really was a driving conceptual idea here and remains so, and I think why this is actually a useful model, even though it's a first approximation of a model, right? Was the very, very influential work by Leslie Ungerleider in Ward, Michigan at the NIH on multiple streams in the visual system.
Yeah.
And that was so they summarized many years of work that had been done, for instance, at Hamster by Jerry Schneider and my other people, but these extremely elegant and highly influential experiments from mostly summarized in the early 80s. And, so Leslie, who is a really amazingly influential and important neuroscientist for many of us, and Mort, likewise, showed, and mostly based on rhesus data, this very important distinction on what then became this notion of what and where pathways. And we were very inspired by that. It was extremely useful. So we thought, well, what would that be like in a language case? So there's no really notion of where. There's a notion of what. Namely, you have to figure out, well, what are we trying to say to each other? Right? So what's the vocabulary? How do you put these things together? What's the meaning you derive? But the where notion is a bit more complicated.
Yeah.
And so we then suggested in a paper in 2004, which is still actually my favorite paper of the ones that Greg and I have done, a paper in cognition, that you really need the kind of dorsal ventral distinction to capture a kind of mapping to what type of problems, like what's the content, and more how type of problems, or a sensory motor interface. Because the logic is like, look, there's two things you have to do. You have to be able to hear stuff, and you have to be able to say stuff.
Yep.
And those things are based on slightly different coordinate systems, right? So let's say the mapping from an auditory signal to something that's stored in your head is, let's say, some kind of form of a spectrogram, or you go from an acoustic representation to something that we don't understand that's stored. And we genuinely don't understand that. Likewise, you have to be able to go to a motor representation, and that's quite different, right? That's using a joint space. You have to program articulators. So what we were trying to grapple with here is, well, what are those mappings? How do you map from a sound, which starts as some kind of biomechanical wave, to either a format that allows you to derive meaning, or to a format that allows you to derive motor commands?
Yeah.
And that was actually the original idea. The original dual stream idea was to actually have dorsal and ventral distinctions borrowed from the interesting insights of vision, and saying, well, if that's a principle of cortex, how would that cash out for the speech recognition case?
Yeah.
And then we developed that further by looking at, again, imaging data, patient data, and then we summarized all that in a paper in 2007, which has become a kind of well-known paper, and saying, like, look, from our point of view, this kind of dual stream model captures a lot of the things. It has bilateral structure for the recognition process, and then it has this dorsal ventral distinction for mapping from sound to meaning, and mapping from sound to sensory motor output. And of course, that's still very coarse. But what's useful about that is it's sort of it's a test bed to develop more detailed hypotheses. Like, what would it be? Where do you map from here to here? What does that mean about the format of representation neurally, computationally? So it's been a quite productive research program in that sense. And it's been well received in the sense that it sort of takes a really substantial step beyond the original language and brain model. And it aligns in important ways with work that colleagues have done, right? So Sophie Scott and Joseph Rauschecker at the same time in 2009 published a very influential paper. They initially pushed a little more on the what-where distinction, because Joseph, of course, was also at the NIH and influenced by Leslie and Mort's work. And all of us were influenced by that, because it's it seems like such a fundamental principle, right? Where that anatomic distinction seems to have some cash out some computational difference in what's being encoded or decoded or represented, right? So the brain is somehow organized to say, look, let's subdivide this task into these subtasks.
Yeah.
And that's one of the principal distinctions. And so there was a sort of a coalescence of a lot of different people working on this. And I think there's now pretty much consensus that something like this is on the right track. Of course, all of our initial ideas are way too coarse, but I think it's not crazy. I mean, or let's say it's not insane. I mean, the models might be crazy, but they're not insane. So.
Yeah, and so that actually brings up design paradigms that actually pull this apart. I mean, how do you, would it all be based in, subtle behavioral tasks and measures, and then careful modeling or careful mapping of then what's corresponding to this? Or I mean, how would you advance or establish this further? What would be the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the appeal of something like that is, so I mean, as you probably figure out, if there's such a thing as a radical Marian or something like that. So I find it extremely helpful to think about problems in the context of the way David Marr formulated to think about problems. So David Marr famously said, look, if you have complicated problems that a nervous system solves, a really productive way to break it down is to think about, at the most abstract level, what he called the computational problem. Like, what is this for? What are you actually trying to accomplish? Let's say it's stereopsis. And then he said, well, then you need to actually specify what are the representations and algorithms that allow that to be calculated, as it were. And then finally, what is the implementational level of description? And I've always found that it's just a really helpful guide to think through a problem. And so this dual stream thing is very much like that, and it allows you to formulate questions at these different levels of approach, right? So first of all, at the computational level, yes, you really want subtle designs, because you want to be drawing from what we know about linguistics. It would be very strange not to take advantage of what other fields have actually learned. And if you're trying to study the neural basis of language processing, you should know something about language.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's just weird. Like you can't just follow your intuition. Language is really complicated, just like vision is. You can't just say, "Oh, I see color." Like you have to actually get into the minutiae.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of, so you can draw from computer science, from linguistics, from experimental psychology, from all these rich fields that have really contributed what we basically know, right? So that would be, so you can come from that point of view. likewise, you can come from the more, let's say, neurobiology or cognitive point of view, like really try to understand the structures, their connectivity, what's really the linking between, let's say, superior temporal gyrus and posterior parietal cortex, and how do you go from, what are the various tracts that connect to inferior frontal cortex? What's going on there?
Yeah.
And is it, why is it 4 tracts or 6? And what are the targets? What are the origins? So you can add, and then finally, the most difficult part, to my mind, is the intermediate specification of MAR, like what actually are the representations in algorithms?
Right.
And that's where we're struggling the most, if you ask me.
Yeah. So yeah, along those lines of computational algorithm and implementation. It seems that if you make maps that are modulated by a task, it shows you kind of, once again, still it's sort of like where it occurs, and to some degree how they interact. What's always interesting to me is that still, we can do that, and that will give us more fine detail and help us guide our models of maybe what's being computed. But as far as the actual algorithm, do we have an idea as to what is, what even a computation looks like in that regard? In terms of certainly we can say, well, these neural ensembles at various levels of processing sort of feed into others and go from the sound to the abstract representation. But and certainly doing brain mapping can pinpoint more where that is. But how do we get, and obviously single neuron recording can maybe get more of the temporal resolution at certain areas. But how do you get at, what's actually going on at this sort of intermediate level of between neurons and areas? That still seems like a mystery.
Yeah, no, look, if you and I knew that, we'd be very rich and famous.
Yes.
Yes. Really, I err here on the side of letting the kind of, let's say, the cognitive science or the behavior take a more leading role, right? So, and partly that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of people who've recently written like really fun and interesting papers about it. There's a really famous one by Jonas and Cording about, can you tell from a microchip, can you figure out what it does just based on a neural recording? And I'm, John Krakauer and a few friends and colleagues and I wrote a paper some years ago saying, well, look, you really have to have, in some sense, the primacy of behavior, because the way we're doing neuroscience at the moment is we're trying to take the leading edge, be essentially to speak in Marian terms, the implementation level. So we do some really clever neuroscience, and we have a lovely characterization of, this aerial or this laminar thing or whatever is going on.
Yeah.
But then what?
Yeah.
Then your linking hypothesis is very, like, how do you actually do the forward model and saying, and once I know this circuit, because when I open the car, this is how it's wired up, I know it's doing multiplication. But it doesn't work that way, right? Yeah. So you have to do it a slightly different approach. And so what we argued in a paper a few years ago, which is, definitely got people's blood pressure going.
It's a great paper. Yeah,
it's a fun paper. I think it's good. It's actually a useful paper, I think, for students and postdocs to take a look at, because it goes in a slightly different, because we're, coming from 5 of us from very different parts of the neurosciences got together to sort of debate a lot and try to figure out why are we stuck with our things. And most of us are sort of admiring, let's say, the circuit cracking that can happen, let's say, in rodent models. And in the end, we concluded that what's missing for all of us is just really precise, carefully, kind of curated and theoretically motivated behavioral work that sort of should motivate the hypotheses we ask of the nervous system. When we say, look, based on these 20, 30, 1,000 experiments, we're very confident that these, 2 stages or 3 things have to happen.
Yeah. You
should take that and approach your friendly neighborhood circuit cracker and say, look, buddy, we know these things have to happen. You have to do multiplication and then convolution, God knows what, right? Whatever your theory is, you need to show me a circuit that can accomplish that.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's not the other way around. So we argued. So I'm in favor of, certainly in my to let the kind of carefully decomposed behavioral studies help us ask the questions that we can now ask with these cool neuro techniques.
Yeah.
Without very well worked out cognitive science and behavior, I think we're toast. We're stuck because we have so much data now. The data are crazy, right?
Yeah.
And so how are you going to do it without a guiding question?
Right. No, I definitely, and yeah, I like the idea of sort of, iterating between sort of, you have to come up with the best possible model you have.
What other choice do we have? And it's been a good model in science so far. So why change now, right? The notion that of course we make observations, but we make observations like when you do a new fMRI study with a new machine, you make certain choices of parameters. And by virtue of that choice, you have implicitly endorsed something like I need to observe this versus, R2 star. I don't know, whatever you're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, but by making a choice, by saying this is actually the field of view.
Yeah.
You're actually, that's not innocent. It's not, and then I think what people misunderstand is, you're just collecting data. Yeah. Well, no, by virtue of the choices you make in your experiment, whether it's parts of the measurement itself or the task you ask for someone to do. Is it detection? Is it discrimination? Is it listening to a symphony, watching? It's very, very, it's not innocent. That's sort of the message.
Right. And not only
you lose your innocence when you're doing an experiment.
And not only does that sort of hone your hypothesis, it's great to, certainly you have to have a hypothesis, but also, let's say you get data. To make sense of the data, you have to have a model.
Yes.
Otherwise, there's no understanding without the model.
That's right. I think there's, but I think and I'm a little surprised that maybe it's my advanced middle age or whatever, but I'm surprised at the amount of, let's say, the enthusiasm for the idea, for what's being advanced a lot is I want a model that simply is predictive. And I think that's where I actually differ on epistemological grounds. So I think prediction, there's a very lovely quote by the philosopher Willard Van Quine in one of his shorter essays, something like, just the notion of just making predictions, that's what science does when it's still kind of like a baby.
Yeah.
Once you get good, you're trying to get understanding.
Yeah.
And that's when things get hard.
Right.
And simply having, really, really impressive predictive models, I'm impressed, qua engineering, qua computation. But what do I do next? It doesn't reveal itself in a kind of, I'm nervous to use the word mechanistic understanding, but just understanding of how is something put together so that this experience is generated. It's, how is it that you can look to the left and suddenly see this shape and segregate color from motion and segregate foreground from background, and at the same time here, the sirens are, it's very, very, very complicated. And it doesn't wear itself on its sleeve.
Yeah, do you think that though? So I always like to go back, and it might be naive, but I go back to, thinking is the brain, I like to, using the analogy of one of the best ideas in science so far is like, natural selection. Darwin, he didn't measure every single, life form, and he didn't, he sort of, I imagine he had sort of a rough idea. He was noticing some variation, and he put forth this model that without knowing genetics, without knowing, and it was sort of like this elegant synthesis of a principle of and so I'm trying to see if there's something. It might be naive to even try to compare, but is there something in the equivalent of that in neuroscience? Like, is there some principle that's waiting to be derived in some way?
There may. I think that would be cool in the sense that the amazing thing about evolutionary theory is it's causal force, right? It's just it's explanatory and not just descriptive.
Yes.
The thing about a brain, I had this discussion last night or the night before with a bunch of people from my lab. Like, everybody and their brother is just excited about the notion of predictive coding.
Yeah.
That's not, that's
black box.
With all due respect to our friends and colleagues who work, and Carl Friston, who's a wonderful scientist, does amazing stuff. It's a bit, it can't be a one-size-fits-all solution that solves all things at all times. Right? It's a
Well,
little bit.
I mean, but also if it is a one-size-fits-all, does it really have really teeth to explain mechanisms? I mean, you can say, well, right, it's more of a construct. It's less of a hypothesis to say, well, the brain is a predictive machine. Yes, that makes sense on some level. It's sort of, we want to model the world as well as we can to.
It might maybe maybe it's just too ambitious. Maybe this is the kind of stuff we talk over, over a beer. Like, what, is there a one-size-fits-all answer to all of neuroscience? But brains are so complicated and have so many, whatever we're currently estimating, right? Human brain, we're estimating 86 billion cells or something like that, of which 69 billion are in the cerebellum, and our theories suck there too. So, maybe the fact that it's, like I said, it's an evolutionary construct of a long time, and it has lots of different bells and whistles and pieces doing the part of your head that keeps your temperature regulated is probably not like the part of your head that makes helps you make a decision.
So all these heuristics that kind of hang together.
Yeah, and why would we imagine a one-size-fits-all solution? That I've never really quite understood. Yes, there are certain motifs. Let's say, do we believe in the canonical cortical microcircuit? Sure, cool idea. Maybe that's true because it's a really useful kind of a Lego block that you can put into your Lego buildings of brains. It doesn't follow that it's doing the same thing because it could differ. And what are the what are the inputs to that canonical circuit? What are they doing something quite different? There's no reason to imagine homogeneity at that scale.
Yeah.
It would be cool if it were true. Maybe it's, hey, maybe Carl is right and it's free energy. But that's very bold.
Yeah.
As it were.
Yeah. To me, I always feel, to the extent that I understand what Carl's trying to say, is that it's satisfying. It's sort of like a way to say, well, that, it's almost like evolution in some sense. You think about it like that kind of makes sense. That could be a unifying principle of generally how things form. You obviously want to optimize survival, and you have to, the better you do predictive coding of the environment, the more you can optimize that. But that's true. But the actual mechanisms. That's sort of like a question of what spatial temporal scale do these operate? What are the algorithms? These are still hypotheses that need to be tested.
One of the things that's holding me back, certainly, and I think it's an idea that I've been coming across a number of times in the last few years, primarily driven by one interesting scholar, Randy Gallistel, is that we are absolutely bankrupt at our understanding of memory. And that's a problem. And so he's highly recommended. So in my own domain, that has to do, for example, with the issue is, what you have a vocabulary. You're like a hyper-educated guy, so you probably have 100,000 words stored in your vocabulary. Those are like the Lego blocks or the atoms that you use. Forget the speech sounds, just basic vocabulary, like cat.
Yes.
Right. What gives? Where? How? What format? Is that in Microsoft Brain? Or Python? What's the data structure of that? And forget the representational question. That's the representational question in the Mar sense. The implementation question is not even on the horizon, because basically our implementation question, our implementational answer to everything in memory is, it's a synaptic mechanism. It's patterns of synaptic connectivity and activity.
Right.
So you have to ask yourself, is that actually plausible? Can that work?
Well, can you potentially answer that question by, I have a colleague of mine who's trying to do, a lot of people are trying to do, theoretical neuroscience, where they have these neural network simulations, and they have these network attractor states, and they all sort of resonate off each other, and it might be the cortex might be some sort of loose associative sort of network that you say cat, and that resonates some ensemble into an attractor.
Yeah, that's the standard story, right? But then things get pretty difficult in terms of the kind of notion of invariances, and actually the notion of digital storage of things, of calculating over variables, which you have to be able to do if you're an animal. Like, you have to be able to calculate the solar ephemeris function.
Yeah.
So things get pretty hairy when you start drilling down a little bit on what's stored and how. And so, so next time you go running, I don't know, this afternoon or whenever you're a fanatic.
I will go running this afternoon.
So, how do you store the number 17? Just us. Talk amongst yourselves.
Well, that reminds me that we have our cicadas coming out, and they, it's a very basic question. They come out every 17 years. How do they count to 17?
Yes. How do they count to 17?
A cicada
So I think there are some really, really interesting questions to be asked there, and and across fields. But that's one of those cases where, the reason I'm thinking about this is on this question that you raised of general principles. Suppose we actually had a more principled answer towards storage that cuts across domains, like whether I'm storing, let's say, a visual object or a word or some quantity I need to be able to use, like 17 years. If we had a more principled answer for that, that would be cool.
Yeah,
that'd be a game changer, right?
Do you think there's hope? From in these neuromodeling generative?
Yeah, I don't know about neuromodeling. Probably that's the most promising. But is that a question or is it a mystery? Are we even asking the question right? And that might be one of those cases where we're maybe just completely barking up the wrong tree. Right? We might just be misled by our intuitions. Because everyone learned, the Hebbian cell assembly.
Right.
And we're like, LTP, LTD, it gets everything. And there's, we can transcribe something at the synapse, and there's some kind of interesting stuff. But then when you start saying, well, what exactly is and then what is stored? What's the information? The actual information.
Yeah.
Where's there
an element, is there a format of
there must be, where is the Microsoft Brain operating system?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's getting really hairy, and that's one of those. So my hope, if I had to put my money on it, we won't know this answer for a long time, but that would have the character of some unification because it would have to hold true across brain areas, mechanism in the sense of a real biological mechanism.
Yeah,
but I don't think we're close to. I don't think we may not even be answering the question the right. We might not be asking the right question or asking the question the right way, or we might just be full of shit altogether.
Or it might reveal itself to be something, sort of. I still have hope that it's something elegant and, sort of intuitively appealing.
Well, one hypothesis is this DNA, right?
Huh.
So that it's intracellular storage, and then that raises the question of okay, suppose that's true.
Yeah.
Then how do you externalize that to the synapse where the kind of information-bearing mechanisms are, and how do you internalize? How do you write information into DNA? And how do you take it out? But that's the reason that has certain appeal is because it's the only thing we know that has basically a digital format.
Yes, and that's how you keep the it sort of stays semi-constant in that regard.
So that would be at least a substrate that could do something like that without being insane.
And you don't think having neuronal ensembles with attractor states or things like that is stable enough? It's sort of.
I don't know. I think that's an empirical question whether it can handle all the different things we do. But I don't know. It's just a really fascinating question every time. Look, the fact that we know, let's say, ballpark 100,000 words, that's not that much information actually, right? So words can store a lot more weird things than that, and in terms of what they cache. Or actually, imagine. You're a brand new bird, you're born, and you now have to fly 4,000 miles for the first time.
Yeah.
How are you doing that? Unless you have some kind of way of calculating with variables, no way to do that, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so show me the money. How is that supposed to work based on experience-tuned things? I just don't get it, actually.
That's, No, I see. That's actually the nature of, anyone, all life, has some sort of hardwiring to get them going, and then they have to be flexible to adapt.
Yeah, and how much? There's always this trade-off. How much is stored and how much is acquired? But then, what is the acquired stuff? Totally flexible, or is it actually sharply constrained by what you have there? Right, what you can't do anything.
Yeah. So it's constrained within. Right. There's some sort of optimization, or this calculation of how.
Yeah, cells have certain, let's say, time constants, right? So they have, because of whatever, this is the sort of, ion channels have the following properties and so on. That's just biophysics. That's just what you get what you get.
Yeah.
So you can't be faster, you can't be, I mean, you just get that range. So you have to do that range.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not some other stuff. So I think that's kind of cool and interesting and weird. Like, why do, so look, I mean, one of the big areas that I've worked on for the last few years is neural oscillations.
Right. I was just going to lead into that. That's perfect. Yeah. I was just going to say.
So that's big. And the reason is because that's just another one of those, so it's of interest to me for very particular reasons. I can talk about it maybe a little parochial and boring, but what makes them so interesting is that they're conserved across size of animals and across very different critters.
Yes.
Right. So, you know, we talk about whatever, theta oscillation, right? So that's a kind of low frequency ballpark, you know, between 4 and 8 hertz, thereabouts, right? So a few cycles per second. And you think, well, what about, okay, so let's take our brain. Okay, cool. Can measure it pretty easily, stick an electrode in. Okay, what about a mouse? Same. Okay, what about a locust? Same. Okay. So it turns out that one of the interesting things is that they're so stable across like brain size, weird species. Well, I guess locusts aren't weird. They're just different. From a locust point of view, they're not weird.
Yeah.
So there's something very elementary from a biological point of view of that kind of physiological excitability cycle, which is a more neutral way to call oscillation, right? So because the word oscillation gets people all like hot and bothered. But excitability cycle, it's more about maintaining, you know, homeostasis.
Okay.
So that's less offensive because everybody wants homeostasis. So when you see that across all, then you're like, well, why are there so many different scales? I mean, if you have a bunch of, so why are you partitioning the world into these different sort of units? And for me, so I just think that's super fascinating. So they are what they are, right? So from a biological point of view, that's just what you have there. And so there's two kinds. I mean, so what are you thinking? Are you thinking either those are just the exhaust fumes? Like when you measure that, that's just the exhaust fumes of the brain doing what it does and doesn't do shit for you.
Yeah.
Or if it's been around for, you know, a long time in every creature, it could have functional consequences of some form.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's the hypothesis I've been going for, you know, and with some colleagues for a while, with one very, very particular question in mind, which is how do you actually segment an incoming data stream into chunks that you can then do stuff with?
Yeah.
So there we've postulated, it's not particularly deep, that you can kind of capitalize on oscillatory activity that basically locks to certain features, and then it gives you a way to sort of chunk what seems continuous into units that you can do whatever math you have to do.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's been a very useful hypothesis, very, very intensively debated. Wildly unpopular with many and popular with some, but it's actually at least been productive in the sense that it allows you to ask certain questions about how you do the segmentation problem.
Well, you know, and I love how it, once again, it sort of has the same flavor of the dual stream model in the sense that it sort of ties in, you know, kind of, I mean, it's sort of like you're trying to develop a hypothesis for, in a sense, of how information is handled in general by.
Yes, that's the idea. Yeah, I mean, how can you, in this case, it's about, well, how do you have to, I mean, well, it could be wrong, right? Maybe you don't need to chunk stuff.
Yeah.
But if you believe the computational theory of mind, so brains do some kind of, you can model them as electrical devices of some form, there has to be some discretization. Otherwise, I just don't know how it's supposed to work. And maybe this is just one possible mechanism to say, hey, take about this much and then put that into your calculator.
Yeah. Yeah. So just to back up one little bit, with as far as the origins of oscillations, I've always wondered, you know, what specifically if you were just drill down all the way into the, you know, the basic molecular biology or even, you know, neurons firing. So, you know, you have a neuron firing, it's a spike. And how do you go from spikes to oscillations?
I mean, so the best, I mean, so there's a ton of work on that for a long time because it's so, it's been such a ubiquitous finding in neurophysiology. And I think that the best, I mean, so I think a good way to think about it is like people who come from biophysics and biophysical modeling. I want to say somebody like Nancy Coppell from BU has done very important work on this. So basically, the notion is if you take a bunch of cells, and you wire them together a certain way, you think of them as capacitors, resistors, what you get out of certain time constants just by virtue of the biophysics. So the origin of these are really when you take a bunch of cells and they're connected in, for example, excitatory, inhibitory connections, you do a bunch of not very trivial math. And what people like Poeppel, who've done this for decades, with very serious biophysical models, show is that then you end up, for example, with, let's say, a gamma cyclicity of a certain form. So it really is a consequence of relatively low-level properties of channels and cells. So it's like, you take a chip, you wire it up a certain way, you ping the thing, and then you get, for example, maybe a damped oscillator, or depending on the wiring. So there are people who've done this for a long time, really at the biophysical modeling level. So that's certainly a level way below what I can really deeply understand or need, for that matter.
Yeah.
But there is basically a bottom where they understand at the level of the molecular biology and the biophysics of how the circuitry generates these. So at this point, even at the laminar level, right? So they're very elegant models why, let's say, supragranular laminar cells have slightly different, let's say, rhythmicity or cyclicity than infragranular layers. So, so that's basically what those of us who are more in the cog neuro and build on that. We assume there's a biophysical basis. You get what you get. Those are your Lego blocks. You can't fuck with those.
Yeah.
And then the question is, do they do anything for you, or are they just kind of running on the side, or do you not care? And then can you show that they have causal force? Yeah. That's the real question. Right?
Okay.
So if you turn them on and off, like, does it mess with your performance, your perception, your production, or whatever? And that's been really the harder part. And that's been the most interesting work. So let's say you have oscillations of a certain time scale, and they really correlate extremely closely with some, visual stream or auditory stream or what have you. Does it matter whether they're there or not? Or are they is it just a correlational structure? And that's been very interesting. And I think that the data are beginning to converge on the notion that you really do need that. Like, if you don't have that, you pay a huge price.
Well, so, your work actually seems to tie in with that. You were talking about maybe some disorders like dyslexia, or other things that there might be therapeutic effects of entraining the rhythm of speech.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of work, and there's people have done really elegant clinical work on this, and but we're still at the level of, I think it's in that sense early days, and we're here. It's one of those cases where, we talked about this a bit earlier, where it will be good and important to have more systematically constructed research between animal models and human models, because we measure pretty coarse things. Like, we can use really high resolution MRI and figure out, okay, so we're going to focus on this lamina. And then we can use, whatever, or the best possible, we can do ECOG or MEG and try to get into the neurophysiology. But in the end, to really get to the nitty gritty, we're going to have to go to animal models.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's, of course, and that I think that's going to be very productive, but it's not easy, because you can't just ask the same question necessarily.
Yes.
That's, we pretend we can, but I think that seems a little bold.
Right. And I like the idea of, just to talk a little bit more about the rhythms. I really do like the idea of sort of, I have to look into those papers, but if you have some sort of networked with neurons with who knows what the size of the network is, but it could be a micro circuit in a you can actually create these these frequencies in some regard. To me, that sort of feels like an element of something where there could be
I have colleagues. So, for example, one of my colleagues in Frankfurt who have extremely an absolute brilliant biologist, Gilles Laurent, who has done this work, for example, working on olfaction in invertebrates, right? And showing really, really meticulously where you can do the invasive work at the, what the local contribution to a computation could be.
Yes.
So my hunch is, reading the stuff that Gilles Laurent has done and others, to say, well, look, if you can show it, and if it's a conserved property because it's something very stable about how neurons are wired up, then wouldn't you want to try to use it in a bigger brain or for a different function? You're getting it for free.
Yeah.
The consequence of and it would be weird to not to say, well, I have this very big fluctuation of energy. I mean, it's a lot of stuff, right? It's a lot of, power being spent. It would be, you'd think that evolution is smart enough to say, hey, this gives me something kind of useful.
Yes.
So we don't know. I mean, it's just, it's interesting because I gave a talk a few weeks ago to a big auditory group where, sort of part of my peeps who were extremely skeptical.
Really?
Very, very skeptical, and for good reasons, because they're that community is largely populated by engineers, and they say absolutely reasonably that, look, you can get a lot of this simply from a sequence of impulse responses. Do you really need the kind of cyclicity that's coming? And my point is, well, I think you do. And here's, we have different forms of evidence, but it's still a very it's a contentious notion in some parts of the sciences, and others, it's phenomenologically obvious. But the hard part is this a part of neural activity that we should pay attention to, or that we say in 10 years, like, hey, we paid attention to it, turned out to be wrong.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, and that's actually interesting where do you know that it's wrong? We're still very early days as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, I'm optimistic about, that's the kind of problem, because it's really about neurophysiology, that I'm optimistic about sort of linking human, that's where you really need imaging, physiology, and animal models. And obviously you need computational expertise to get some kind of grip on this stuff, because it's just so gnarly. So some smart graduate students and postdocs are going to crack that thing. And
Yeah. And that's actually, this kind of brings into the next point of what is the role of, sort of backing up a little bit and maybe going a little bit parallel, but, as far as fMRI is concerned, the field's been criticized a lot for, just doing cartography and you're looking at where what happens, but that doesn't really, showing where something happens doesn't really explain much at a deep level. But used, as you were mentioning, in combination with, these models, and used in combination with other maybe scales and measure, it helps. Maybe you can mention it better than I can, but as far as it helps to inform at some scale, maybe it helps you know the organization, know where to look. But
well, I think it's crucial for theory building too, right? So for some cases, it could even be decisive.
Yeah.
And for some cases, it could be certainly crucial. Like, look, it matters a lot to me. For example, if you do an imaging study in which you show that, let's say, spatially disparate populations of cells are actually still, recruited for that task, because it invites the inference that you really need to do. That has to be respected in your model.
Yes. Yeah.
And that could be absolutely. If you had theory A says everything's the same, theory B says no, you need two forms of things. That's critical.
Yes. Yeah. And there are these dimensions, right, in fMRI that, right, you look at magnitude, you look at latency, you look at the timings, you look at adaptation. You get a lot of,
the data set is pretty rich. So I think that's, it would be, you just take whatever evidence. I think, so maybe this is a point to make here for, for me, what I've learned, maybe I read it somewhere on the interwebs. It's really important to make a careful distinction between, let's say, observations and data and evidence. And what we traffic in, sometimes we just make an observation, like we're walking.
Yeah.
But what we traffic in are kind of, in the end, evidence, because we try to say this is evidence against or for or supporting, and that's a little bit different than just collecting a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
And if you have the question formulated in a way that you get the right answer, then maybe you need fMRI, maybe you need ECOG, maybe you need, transcriptomics, who the hell knows? It depends entirely on what you're trying to explain and what is the right kind of evidence to adjudicate between the alternatives.
Yeah.
And so I'm very committed to, don't just collect data all the time. Know what it's evidence for or against or whatever.
Right. Having this iteration between model and converging evidence.
Yeah.
I think is and it would be nice to actually, try to systematize that. I think in the field in general. I think it seems to me, and maybe I'll shift gears a little bit as well. We talked a little bit about scale. We talked a little bit about models. But it seems to me also that a lot of graduate students, when they start out, they just, they're coming up with a question, and then you come up with, you use the tool that you have, and you do the best you can, and you sort of answer something using your tool. I mean, and I'm, my own personal experience when I go to the Society for Neuroscience meeting, I'm always, I've been going for a long time now, and I'm always overwhelmed with how much there is, but I'm also sort of bothered by the fact that, I mean, everything that I look at looks like, oh, well, we're making an advancement. We saw this extra correlation at all the different scales, and I feel like, I look at like the field of neuroscience as like a system, and it seems like with any system, you need to have better, cross-discipline communication. It seems that, or maybe even principles of how a model that's being built that everyone is aware of in some sense. So you would have. It seems like there's a lot of effort, but not much ratcheting forward.
Yes, and I think that's that's sort of a little bit with what I was telling you sort of semi-flippantly earlier, which is the difference between, let's say, big data or a lot of data and big theory, right? So we're just collecting stuff like mad, and we have, like you say, very few guiding principles that help us organize this stuff. I mean, like all of us, I mean, I think you and I have had this discussion before, like, should we really just be acquiring more data all the time? We have so much data lying around already. Shouldn't we actually analyze the shit? At some point, I mean, we do like one or two analyses, and we're like, yeah, that was cool. All right, let's archive it.
Yeah,
let's do the same experiment
so
again.
Much.
It's really lame, actually.
Yeah, and it's so rich. I mean, there's so much, and it does seem like there is, it's part of the culture of neuroscience too. I mean, people, graduate students want to get the degree, they want to establish their hard-won, piece of information, but it doesn't seem like, it seems like, there's too many different domains, but also that go across scales, and all the way from molecular levels.
Well, I mean, so take. I mean, I think that's one of the things that was such a unbelievably important contribution of the work that that Leslie and Mort did with those early things of the notion of this multiple visual systems had so many consequences, not just for biology, but for computational modeling, for psychophysics. I mean, right? So that was a kind of unifying. I don't know if unifying is the right word. It's kind of stimulating heuristic, right? I mean, actually, the very first experiments I did as an RA had to do with trying to look at actually potential interactions across putative parallel streams. There were these claims of like, are these streams independent and parallel, or is there crosstalk? And some of the very first psychophysical studies I did were on actually that. On so at isoluminance, for example, when you can you still see motion using, for instance, something like smooth pursuit, where you have to actually calculate local motion, even though there's no more luminance contrast and stuff like that. One's supposed to feed, the ventral stream, one's supposed to feed the dorsal stream and stuff like that. So it stimulated behavioral studies and neural studies, and so. But that was a pretty coarse-grained thing, but it was immensely, and it stimulated a shitload of language research. So,
so you're right, something like that, some more unifying
some broader unifying things that you can say, and then you can argue against it, you can argue for it. I'm sure that Leslie and Mort got a lot of crap for there were people who were thinking that's just silly, like, what are you talking about, this. So just an organizing principle that helps you sort of sort, where might this fit? Right?
And it would help guide a lot of potential research.
It's good to have something to argue against too. You're saying like, oh,
yes. All right, well, there's obviously so much to talk about. One last thing I'd like to, or two last things. One very last thing, or one thing before the last is you had an interesting paper. I mean, just relevant to me because I'm reading his book right now, The Brain from Inside Out with Busaki, and it strikes me as and I'm trying to get the nuance of what you were arguing in your critique of his paper, and it just it doesn't have to be a long discussion, but I was actually. My assessment of his book, at least so far as I'm reading it, is that it seems to make sense. I mean, we have, the brain is sort of along the lines of David Marr's, construct. You have instead of you're looking at it sort of like from the implementation, or you're looking at it from the computation and algorithm.
Well, I mean, this is where I respectfully disagree with you. So Yuri, who's actually a friend of mine and a colleague, so he's at NYU, and so Yuri and I wrote a pretty strident critique of that book with one of my graduate students, Federico Adolfi.
Yeah.
And then Yuri and I actually had a podcast debate about the book on the brain.
Cool. Okay, I gotta listen to that. That's
and so I actually am a fan of this book. Otherwise, I wouldn't read a book if I didn't think it's really rich. It's full of really absolutely amazing observations, and Yuri is this like amazing neurophysiologist, right? So, but where I actually disagree, so I think he does not give credit to the last 100 years of psychology, cognitive science, computation, that whole field, in the sense that he attributes a kind of naivete to those ideas that I think is false. And I think he doesn't attribute actually the rich technical knowledge to those fields. So the way Yuri wants to approach this from the inside out versus outside in is to say, look, we can characterize principles of the brain, or let's say features of brains really carefully. For example, he's into, let's say, oscillations in the context of hippocampal physiology or sharp wave ripples and that kind of stuff, like a lot of things that are there. And then that should actually yield the psychological question we're trying to explain.
Okay.
Right. So the inside out notion is really driving the question asking from the perspective of the implementation in the brain.
Okay.
And I think that, so I disagree with Yuri about that stridently. And so Federico and I wrote this paper saying the brain from inside out turned upside down or something like that.
Yeah.
And what we wanted to say is like, look, even when you think you're doing that, you're bringing an implicit theory to the table.
Yeah. Yes.
So what we call the implementation sandwich. So you think you're studying something about the implementation, but while you're doing that, in the back of your head is already an assumption that it's about something, right? So for example, this is about memory.
Yeah.
Because otherwise why are you measuring that?
Yeah. You're already assuming this
right. So it's abduction, right? So we're saying like, look, of course we're sympathetic to the neurophysiology. It's marvelous and critically important.
Yeah.
But you're bringing in, so before you even do the implementation, you're already an implicitly, you have like an implicit model or a folk theory or an intuition, a gut level thing. Because otherwise, I'm sorry, man, why are you sticking an electrode somewhere to look for sharp wave ripples?
Right.
Like, don't tell me you found a sharp wave ripple, and by looking at the shape, you realize that it has something to do with memory. Come on. I mean,
that's a really good point. That's a really good point. But so maybe the middle ground would be to keep an open mind about redefining what the maybe there is something more subtle than.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. So look, I mean, actually, Yuri and Fede and I are writing a paper together right now.
Okay.
So trying to sort out where we see some possible openings, because we're friends, we like each other. We happen to disagree about this point.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to sort out where this might lie. And so maybe I'm too far on one end, Yuri's far on the other end. Fede is more a computational guy. He's he'll probably be right because he's the youngest. And the idea is that so there's a bunch of ideas in the book that are really important and I think that are on the right track. And the question is simply how to sharpen them. Do you sharpen them by virtue of doing more fine-grained biology or neurobiology, or carefully crafted, cognitive science or computational work, right? Yes. To really, get a grip on these things. And I do think that Yuri and I roughly agree that something like take the C. elegans thing, right? So C. elegans, every cell, the transcriptome, the genome, every goddamn feature of that stupid little thing, and you still don't have a model of how that worm does what it does.
Yeah, which is fascinating. Yeah.
But that's not good news, right? I mean, that should be because that should be the crown. That should be like the crown jewel of reductionism.
Yeah.
Right. Here is every goddamn piece of this engine is known, and you can't figure out how it's working. That's not good news. Now we're beginning to have some ideas, but if you ask, our premier C. elegans people are like, well, we understand a little bit about why the worm moves to the left, or defecation. That's a circuit that's well worked out. That's like, there's, everything about that creature.
Yeah.
Why don't we have a good forward model of its
Yep.
behavior? And so I think my colleague Tony Mofshin here at NYU has a good line about that in the paper he wrote some years ago, that it's an incredibly good test bed to build experiments on.
Yes.
But the knowledge of that on its own right doesn't explain anything.
Yeah.
Just like a good, it's like a really good map of the whole thing, and you can now really build on it and say, let's try, let's test this or that.
Yeah.
But simply having that information, even in all its gory detail, does not explain anything.
Which is fascinating. Yeah. I mean, you can throw all kinds of analysis at it, and
yeah. So I think I read that maybe it was like 10 years ago when Tony, and I was like, yeah, that's actually a good point, and that's really not great news actually for us. So it was like, oops, like, so I think that Bujaki's approach here is really good. If we could I just want to convince Yuri that he's actually, we call it implementation sandwich because the implementation sandwich between an intuitive theory that he brings to the task, and then later on, of course, he's like, oh, and then we theorize about what it's for. But I'm like, yeah, you did that to begin with.
Yeah.
I'm not buying otherwise, right? So that's what's called the process of abduction in philosophy.
Yeah. That's a good point. I mean, right. I mean, Russ Prolrock has written a paper about, sort of kind of related in some sense of the idea that maybe we need to update our more cognitive models of like, for instance, analogously, the old days, people wondered, they thought living things had life force, and we're looking for life force, and you realize it's more complicated than that. And, but it's like to update those with the data. But you're right with Pisaki. He starts out with sort of an idea in some sense of what
so he wrote an earlier version of this paper, actually. He wrote a paper that was the early version of the book.
Okay.
And so he's much more clear about, he's sort of very straightforward. He's like, look, and I think that basically the terminology of psychology is bankrupt. Yeah. And I respectfully disagree. Like, individual terms are probably not that good, but that doesn't mean there hasn't been a lot of technical progress. Yes. You wouldn't go to someone who works on, I don't know, episodic memory or something and say, you don't know shit. They've worked for 100 years and they have pretty good ideas and across levels of analysis. So they may be not on the right track, but there's technical domain knowledge.
Yeah, there's tons of behavior that
take it. So here's an example. I should write that down. I want to ask Yuri. Suppose you were like Hubel and Weasel and you're noodling around, like with your old electrodes, and would you ever hypothesize the end-stop cell? This is very weird, like, unless you said you had a notion of feature.
Yes.
Like, there's a lot of, like, it just doesn't come for free. It's not like your data come pre-labeled with, like, here's my spike train, and it says, oh, that's what I'm doing. Right. So you have to have an implicit presupposition of some form. And
it kind of hits on the head what we do. We create these constructs to guide. It's sort of to guide what we're looking for, and hopefully, I guess the point is that you have to iterate and update.
Yeah, that's right. So then you're off to the races, right? Then it's pretty clear. They're like, oh, okay, this was my idea. Or, okay, that's good for that, but it's shitty for this thing, right. And I have to fix that. So then you're kind of in this. In the Krakauer paper, we have a graph like that where you say, like, you start and you kind of. Then you ask a question about implementation that tells you, like, you have to sharpen up your idea, and then you get better and better in some kind of systematic way. At least there's a research strategy.
Yes.
But there's always an initial hunch. I just don't believe that that you would intuit from an observation of a curve.
Yes.
Function. Like, if you had seen your first bold curve ever, you'd be like, okay, is it a car? Is it a tree? You wouldn't be like, holy shit, it's oxygenated versus deoxygenated hemoglobin. You're like, what? There's no way. You would simply not know, right? And I was like, what does that have to do with oxygenation? We're just seeing some.
Right.
The observation in its own right came with a long. The same thing is true for physics. People don't build CERN or the Large Hadron Collider without unbelievably specific predictions to the.
I don't know. Good idea.
Degree, right?
Yeah.
That would be, and then they're looking for like this, whatever, 5 sigma little bump in the thing. Not like, oh, we're just going to build this thing, shoot some things around, like see what's going on.
Smash some atoms. Yeah. No, that's a really good analogy with bold contrast. I haven't thought of that. Right. You sort of have to start out with sort of a very clear hypothesis. And
you knew what you were looking for, something in particular. You're like, oh, maybe it has to do with, I don't know. You didn't see that curve and like, well, fuck if I know.
And then it gets refined or differentiated, whatever. Yeah, that's interesting.
But you needed to start with some, let's say, pre-theoretical hunch or heuristic, or like just a gut level intuition based on, because you read stuff, stuff, you've seen stuff before. It's not like you're not like a blank slate when you come to scientific work.
Right, and that's what I think people are hoping for. Like true reductionists sort of hope that the concepts will organize themselves and be emergent in some sense.
Yeah, I think that's I like the sort of naive idealism of that. It's virtuous, but it's wrong.
Yeah. Well, as a practical, but it's interesting though, because the whole with the NIH, they're trying to do like what's called RDoC, where having data-driven recategorization of psychiatric classification, which is kind of maybe saying, oh, maybe we're wrong here, or maybe it's not quite right, but it's not like throwing it out. It's sort of iterating in some sense. And maybe the data will organize itself differently. But once again, it goes to the point where you have to start with something, and then
you start. Yeah, you're looking for something.
Yeah. Interesting. All right. Well, one last question. So, I always like to end with some sort of advice for young investigators, because I think that, I have to say that I really feel, whenever I hear you talk, or whenever I feel like your impact is so high, because, you have this sort of strident, you're curious, but at the same time, you're bold, and
I'm opinionated. That's true. You can say,
but you also, you take it all in. You listen as well. It's not. There's a lot of people who are opinionated who just, going down their avenue. But I think that you have a style that is really, I think, great as far as science is concerned.
I appreciate that. I enjoy what we do. I think what we do is really cool and fun, and I enjoy. The most. Look, I think that the most important thing that we get is to work with students and postdocs who do amazing stuff, and we get to watch.
Yeah,
and that's like a great privilege, actually.
So, do you have any advice for young? What do you tell your any general?
I say a lot of things. So, the main thing is that if you have an interview with me in my office, you get that thing. So you have to. So, one thing I prize more than anything else is be nice to each other. I have absolutely no patience for shitty behavior. This is not okay.
Yeah.
So you're supposed to work hard, because it's hard stuff and it's cool. Work hard and be nice to people. That's number one. That's like, yeah. And I think it's a good, and where the be nice is the most important part. Yeah. You can sometimes be lazy, but you should always be nice to people. Always be generous. Don't be ungenerous. It's just gross.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean you can't be a little competitive and get your juices flowing, but be a generous, caring person. My main, but other stuff that sort of has always been on my mind for people, at least in my labs, is that you should be extremely thankful for the people who support you, like your parents, your partners, your friends, because you're doing a weird job. You're very, you get to work on something completely, largely bizarre.
Yeah.
And there are people who are tolerating you, actually. They're tolerating your idiosyncrasies and your passions and your weird hours and your disappointments. We live off of rejections of papers, rejections of grants, battle-hardened, and I think it's really nice to just acknowledge that you live in an infrastructure of people who are actually tolerating that you're allowed to do that. So that's really important.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think, right. I think it's really, just be nice, be nice to your partners and parents and friends, and sometimes even your advisors if you're getting support. One thing I've always found really helpful is, and I think that's not appreciated enough, and that's come to me much later. I wish I'd known more about that when I was a student. Stuff is read old stuff. Read old stuff in the sense that I'm now going back. For example, one of the things I'm really interested in is this notion of, it's a concept of efference copy. right? So efference copy is one of those. It's actually also a very nice discussion in Yuri's book, and that's one of the ideas that he and I will probably discuss more.
Yeah.
An idea that was really developed in the 1950s, but really comes actually from Ernst Mach, the physicist from the 19th century. It's incredibly useful in terms of things like arm movement control, speech motor control, eye movement control. It's really a very important algorithm.
Yeah.
And like you learn all this stuff from the old papers because they didn't. Because what's so cool about the older literature, it's not so full of data. I mean, some of the data you're like, yeah, okay, funny. Although, look, it's what they had then. But because of that, some of the conceptual analysis is more careful.
Huh. Yeah.
If you read, for example, like here's a good book, for instance. So one book that everybody should read is Nicholas Tinbergen's The Study of Instinct, right? So from the 19th, so these people who are, very, very careful analysis of the problem. So maybe they had like a shitty electrode or, a complicated species, but
they thought carefully.
Very careful thinking is actually, and I wish I had learned that earlier to be like, yeah, I should read some of those old papers where people just sat down and said, okay, let's just kind of struggle through this problem. What the hell is going on?
Yeah.
And also the other thing that's nice about it is the style is so different. Now we write papers that are so formulaic, right? Because we're all trying to suck up to the journals and each other as editors. Like what happened to the kind of free-flowing and carefully curated style where we really developed an idea? So I think reading old stuff is really good.
Yes.
And what else do I think of to say? Well, one saying that I have in front of me always is that I think is really, really hard, and I have not succeeded with this. Is you have to free yourself from the praise of others.
Well, it seems like you've done a good job. I mean, like you said, all the battles.
Yeah, but it's easy for me to say. I have tenure and I have a good job, right? I mean, but I think it's really hard to trust yourself and do it for not the praise of others.
Yeah, or at least the people that right. I think
it's a really hard. I think it's a really, really hard thing. But I think it's just important for your own. Yeah, do it for the right reasons.
Yeah, and right, exactly. Not there has to be a certain self-driven sense of.
I get it. I mean, I'm sure it's for you as well. It's just there's such joy in actually watching trainees in your lab do all this cool stuff that I'd never thought possible.
It is fun. It is.
I'm just really proud of the people in my lab. I think it's just really cool what they do, and it gives me that's the biggest joy is the joy I get. It's just these discussions and lab meetings and then the good stuff they do. I'm like, wow.
Yeah,
that's great. I think.
Yeah, I love to give good advice, and then I love to sort of get out of their way and then provide this atmosphere.
Yeah, I think that's sort of the important thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been a great discussion. We could have gone.
Thank you, Peter, for having me. I mean, it's really fun to just chat about all kinds of general issues.
Yeah, I'm much to think about still. So, all right. Thank you.
Thank you.